So we're going to talk about salivary gland neoplasia, particularly newly defined entities and concepts. So up to this point, I've been talking about squamous cell carcinoma and stuff, and that's bread and butter, and we all need to know that stuff. But my true passions in this field are salivary gland and sinonasal tract tumors, particularly new tumors, new variants, et cetera. So for one of these courses, I always give myself one course to talk about these concepts, which admittedly are not as high yield as squamous cell carcinoma. So which one do you go with? There's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about for salivary and new stuff for sinonasal tumors. So it was a bit of a conundrum. I thought about it a while, so I went with salivary. So I thought about this meme. I don't know if y'all are aware of that meme. Anyway, so salivary gland tumor stuff is certainly something that we get. It's not like we're not going to encounter these, and they're tough. As anybody who's done any of these know, these are tough areas. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, mostly it's because they're so low volume that these are so challenging. And, obviously the salivary gland tumors are maybe the most broad histologic spectra that you can see in any human neoplasia. It's really quite stunning. And not to make things worse, there are these new findings that are coming out all the time, mostly molecular nowadays, that are really altering the way that we sign these things out in pretty profound ways that we're going to take a look at a few examples of that here. This is a mess, I know, but it's a pretty high yield slide actually, and it's just a summary of some of these molecular alterations, all of which pretty much have been in the last 10 years or so. It's really quite amazing, and it's always changing, and so I literally, I'm not even exaggerating, I modify this every time I give this talk, including, about an hour ago, I had to, I'm going to add this, and so there's, these are interesting, of course, but the reason that I care about them most is the ways in which they alter classification and diagnosis. Because for the most part, these alterations are tumor defining. So it allows us to have a genetic gold standard that we never really had before, right? 10, 15 years ago, you get this tumor and one expert says this, one expert says this, and you're kind of like, well, I don't know. Now we can run it on the RNA-seq machine, see what fusion it has. Maybe it has a novel fusion. Maybe it's something entirely new. And really, it's allowed us to perfect our histologic diagnoses in really neat ways. And again, we'll go over some of that here. So let's jump right into this case. A 13-year-old boy, young boy, showing up with a parotid mass that was kind of fluctuant. On gross exam, it was clearly cystic, well circumscribed, pretty decent size, cystic and filled with this dark fluid. Histologically, on low power, we can see it is, yes, very cystic, multicystic, and has a very prominent lymphoid stroma, complete with numerous germinal centers. And this is what the lining looked like pretty much through most of the tumor. Pretty bland, certainly not ugly or anything. And I will let you decide what you would diagnose this tumor as. I will tell you, it was originally signed out as a Wharton tumor at our children's hospital, and I actually called my colleague about something else. He's like, hey, you wouldn't believe I just found a Wharton tumor in a 13-year-old. Obviously, that's all sorts of bells are going off, like that's wrong. I would love to see that. So I took a look at it, and a lot of it did resemble Wharton tumor, but there were other areas that started giving me weird vibes. For one thing, started getting areas that were a little bit more thickened, obviously kind of squamoid, still very bland, but squamoid and some mucinous cells. This by itself is actually not so bad. You can get metaplasia in a Wharton tumor. So this is not so unauthorized, but then it gets worse the more I look at it. Focal areas where the thickening is pretty pronounced, this kind of squamoid whorls, is pretty weird. And then you start getting areas where it's like almost budding off of the cystic spaces in an infiltrative-like pattern, even though uniformly very, very bland and virtually no mitotic activity, et cetera. So with these findings, I said, hey, would you mind if we got a FISH study to analyze this tumor?
We're actually going to be talking about the human papillomavirus. And we're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about this virus. And we'll talk about the epidemiology of HPV-driven cancers of the head and neck, the morphology, the clinical implications, and then our role in this whole thing, which is the testing for it, right? So first the epi. So Dr. Harold Zurhuysen, he was the professor who, together with his team, really was the first to describe this association between human papillomavirus and cancer. I mean, who knew that a viral infection could result in cancer? And so back in 1976, he published a seminal paper on condyloma cuminata human genital cancer. Fast forward 25 years, and Maura Gillison and her group were describing evidence for a causal association between HPV and a subset of head and neck cancers. Dr. Zurhuysen went on to describe that it was in fact HPV 16 and 18, and won the Nobel Prize in 2008 for his work. So the epidemiology of head and neck squamous cell cancer. So in 2022, the estimated causes of head and neck squamous cancer is over 66,000, with 15,000 estimated deaths. We know that 3/4 of head and neck squamous cell cancers are attributable to tobacco and alcohol. I mean, that's what we always knew, right? That was the thing you would ask in your clinical history. Do you have a history of tobacco smoking, alcohol smoking for head and neck cancers? That's what it was. But now we know that up to 25% are going to be related to infection with high-risk HPV, with HPV 16 taking up the great majority of the cases. And the association with HPV is highest for cancers in the oropharynx. Okay, so when we're talking about head and neck squam, the ones that we think about with HPV are going to be in the oropharynx predominantly. The risk of this type of cancer is related to the lifetime number of oral sex partners. So it is high-risk sexual activities. It's independent of alcohol and tobacco abuse. This type of tumors have a younger age at onset, so it's about 3 to 5 years younger than the HPV negative cancers of the head and neck. The infection for HPV does have a bimodal distribution, but being infected does not mean that you're going to get the cancer. And many times the cancer is cleared. The actual median age of developing the cancer is about 63. There is a male to female ratio with male predominance, whites more than blacks. The thing about these tumors is there's an enhanced sensitivity to radiation, and they have an improved survival. So that's important. In this SEER population study, talking about the trends of head and neck cancer over a decade between 2002 and 2012, overall head and neck cancers have slightly decreased, but what you see is that cancers of the larynx have gone down in time, and that's predominantly because of smoking, right? We're smoking less. So laryngeal cancers have gone down, but look at HPV-related cancers of the head and neck, and this is continuing to go up. But this is in the US, by the way. This is really, we're talking about the United States and Europe. Here, again, cancer statistics, you see new cases of head and neck cancer, 54,000, and new cases of cervical cancer, which is an HPV, we know is an HPV-related cancer, is 14,000. And this is we have very good screening in place to prevent cervical cancer in the US. But look at pharyngeal cancers, right? So, and we've already said that about 80% are going to be due to HPV. So this is actually telling us that there are more HPV-related pharyngeal head and neck cancers than cervical cancers in the United States.
So this talk is going to be about neuroendocrine cells. And this is actually the hardest talk for me to give in this course because it's like so many things. Disclosures are the same, goals and objectives are in the notes. Again, we're going to start here and I hope we're going to get there by the end of the hour. But we're talking about an awful lot of pathology today because neuroendocrine cells are literally from the head to the tail. So they're everywhere. Most of them actually live in little isolated things like C cells in the thyroid living around the follicles, the gut neuroendocrine cells, the islets of Langerhans, pulmonary neuroendocrine cells. But there are some neuroendocrine organs like the pituitary, the parathyroid, so, adrenal medulla. These are cells basically that are all extremely similar structurally and functionally, except they make different final products. What they do is they take up amines and they convert them into peptide hormones. They have very well-developed rough endoplasmic reticulum to make these hormones. They all have good Golgi complexes that are used to package up the hormones into secretory granules, which then go to the cell periphery where they're stored until there's a stimulus for release, and then they're secreted into the bloodstream. And if you want to think of them as being actually little mini neurons, because neurons, remember, do exactly the same thing, except they touch their neighbors to give the signal, whereas neuroendocrine cells give the signal into the bloodstream, so it has a systemic effect. Now, tumors of these cells have a lot of different names, and I just want to debunk a few and kind of help you understand current terminologies. Many people still use the term carcinoid tumor, and the lung guys are the strongest holdouts. They really love this terminology, but we're convincing them to change as well. First of all, it's wrong. Carcinoid, again, is an oid, and I don't like anything that's an oid because it means you don't know what you're talking about. Carcinoid means carcinoma-like, which means it's not really a carcinoma, but these things metastasize, so let's stop fooling ourselves. And in addition to all of that, clinically now, carcinoid is a syndrome, and as soon as you say the word, clinicians start measuring urinary 5-HIAAs. So we have to kind of back away from that and recognize that that's the only place that term should be used. In the pancreas, we used to call things islet cell tumors. There's a lot of evidence, first of all, that they don't even start in the islets. They come from ducts. And we just don't want to use that terminology anymore. There's older terminology like apodomas, again, gone by the wayside. So the two that I want to concentrate on are neuroendocrine carcinoma and neuroendocrine tumor. And I was actually a proponent for a long time of not using this tumor thing because when it metastasizes, it's obviously a carcinoma. But you know, Mauro Papati, who I mentioned yesterday, he gave us those beautiful pictures of thyroid. He also gave me this very nice picture of a net. And he said, Sylvia, you just have to accept this terminology, go play tennis. Well, we've actually all agreed to say we're going to use specific terms and they're going to mean something different. So there are neuroendocrine tumors and there are neuroendocrine carcinomas. And this actually got formalized in 2018 when we had this working group from the WHO that finally agreed that all neuroendocrine tumors everywhere in the body, all neuroendocrine neoplasms everywhere in the body should come under a consistent framework that defines terms that we all will agree on. Because they arise everywhere, including, by the way, the paraganglia. I mentioned all the other organs, but paraganglia are also in this category. They can be epithelial or neuronal. The epithelial ones are all the ones that arise in epithelial tissues. Paraganglia are neuronal or paraneuronal, but they all have the same structures and functions. They express very similar proteins like INSM1, synaptophysin, chromogranin, somatostatin receptors, all of these things that all neuroendocrine cells do. So we need to address this as an entire family. And what we agreed upon was that neuroendocrine neoplasia is that overarching family. And then we have both well and poorly differentiated neuroendocrine neoplasms of epithelial tissues and a third family of paraganglia. So the terminology now, neuroendocrine tumor means a well-differentiated neuroendocrine neoplasm of epithelial cells, epithelial type cells, and neuroendocrine carcinoma refers to a poorly differentiated neuroendocrine neoplasm. Now, what does that mean?